off the air, we were talking a bit about present state of economics and economics in academia. Would you be able to speak a bit about economics today and whether you think economics is boring, as you kind of
Yes.
said it might
Well,
be?
I'm probably not a trustworthy guide to the subject because I haven't
Mm,
actually been working in conventional economics for quite a long time. But my impression is that an awful lot of it is doing is using mathematics in order to appear to be doing something new when you don't actually have anything very new. I had a blog post a long time ago about uh, the the extensive versus the intensive margin in economics. That, as you may know if you've read Ricardo, which you should do because he's an interesting guy, he thinks of the intensive margin in agriculture as growing more wheat on the fields where we're already growing wheat. And the extensive margin is putting new land under cultivation. And the intensive margin in economics or any other field is trying to say something new about a question that smart people have been trying to say things about for 100 years. The extensive margin is thinking of some area you can apply your science to that it hasn't been applied to before. And uh, I suppose Adam Smith, back before there really was a thing called economics, is working the extensive margin when he offers an economic explanation of the end of feudalism, which you may or may not be familiar with, but it's a lot of fun. Similarly, Gary Becker, when he applied economics to the family and to crime, was working on the extensive margin. And Peter Leeson is somebody who has done things along those lines when he analyzed 18th century piracy, for example, in quite an entertaining book. And to me, at least, that's more fun. It is obviously possible that you will work the intensive margin to think up something new, but it's also quite likely that you will find some way of claiming to do something new because you're using a new technique or some new data or something to look at something people have already looked at pretty extensively.
mm.
So my impression, and it may be unfair, is that an awful lot of economics is that, uh, and not enough of it is actually applying economics to learn new things, think about new questions, and so forth.
Mm. Do you have any intuition about why we might be kind of afraid to apply and think about new problems and new areas in economics? Is it maybe people are kind of scared and they'd rather just build incrementally on things that they've already done, and perhaps there's a lot of competition, and so people don't want to put themselves out there,
Yeah.
or
That is part of it may be the issue of the risk that it back when I was at UCLA for a number of years and I did not get tenure, and I had an interesting conversation with the chairman of the department uh, at the time, and he said, "Look, you're a smart guy. If you followed the journals and wrote articles on whatever is the current hot topic, you would get a vita that would get you tenure at someplace like UCLA." And I said, "Yep, that's probably true. If you were me, would you do that?" And he said, "No." And and it seemed to me that I think of that at least as the example of that trade-off, that I was doing stuff that I thought was interesting. Uh, I eventually got tenure at a law school doing economic analysis of law, which is where I spent the last 25 or 30 years of my career. Uh, but it's risky in the sense that it's not as if the senior professor in this specialty can say, "Well, look, if you do such and such, we can get you in such and such a journal." Uh, and I figured that if I had done what he was describing, I would probably have ended up with tenure at a good school, but I would probably have done work that nobody would be reading 100 years from now. And I prefer to do work which I at least hope to think people will think of as novel and interesting 100 years from now. My very first published journal article was an economic theory of the size and shape of nations, which at least claimed to explain the map of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present. And many years later, I came across somebody's retrospective article on economics of size and shape of nations Mine was the first thing he listed, and the next was 10 years later,
Uh-huh.
by Jim Buchanan, incidentally, who was a little later a colleague of mine, and an interesting guy. But
What, yeah, why did you want to work on a wide range of sort of more out there ideas rather than working on things people were sort of currently working on? And what are some of your most important ideas that you're proud of?
huh. Well, the size of nations would be the first one. And I guess the thing that strikes me as possibly most important is something I wrote quite a while ago, which I referred to as a positive account of rights. And it was an attempt to understand rights not as either a legal or a moral category, but as a description of human behavior. And that ultimately came out of the influence on me of a colleague at UCLA, Earl Thompson, who is, I think, the brightest, not very famous economist I've encountered. And he was interested, among other things, in commitment strategies. And I think of it initially in terms of property rights in animals, that we know that there are territorial animals, and they are animals where an individual somehow marks the territory he's claiming. And as I like to imagine it, turns a switch in his brain such that another member of the same species and sex trespassing on that territory, he will fight desperately to keep him out. And a fight to the death is usually a loss for both sides, unless the trespasser is much stronger. Even if the trespasser wins, he's likely to get injured. Consequently, if the trespasser realizes that commitment strategy, it pays him not to trespass. And I think you can think of human institutions as a much fancier version of that system. That if somebody grabs one of your children's toys and steals it and goes running off, you go running after him, yelling and so forth, even though the toy only costs $3.
Mm.
And the cost to you of trying to catch him, call the cops or wrestle him down or whatever you do in response to somebody stealing your kid's toy is almost certainly more than the value of the toy. But you have committed yourself. You've got an internal way of thinking in your head such that there are certain things which you are committed to bear unreasonably large costs to stop. Those are the things you think of as violating your rights. Since you're English, England provides me one of my favorite examples. The Falkland Islands are of almost no value to anybody. They had a few hundred people on them. And yet England sent its only aircraft carrier, a small fleet of other ships, a good deal of the way around the world to get fairly close to the South Pole in order to fight Argentina, in order to save its claim to those islands. And that's pretty crazy in one sense. On the other hand, if it's clear that England is not committed to do that sort of thing, there's always Gibraltar that somebody else might want. There might be other
Mm.
places where. So I think it makes sense to think of a civil order, as it were, as a network of commitment strategies. The strategies themselves depend on shelling points, on having clear lines to draw. So I originally got into that idea because Gordon Tullock, who was another colleague at VPI and a very interesting guy, had written something arguing that it was impossible to bargain out of anarchy. That if you started out with no government and no rule enforcement, agreeing to something would have no effect because there's nobody to enforce the agreement. And I concluded that he was wrong. And that the reason is that the agreement itself establishes a shelling point, establishes a bright line that you can commit to. And so I imagine it as two people, they're the only people in the world, and they would like not to fight with each other because that could get them hurt. So initially they agree, all right, there's a stream here. Everything on this side of the stream is mine. Everything on that side of the stream is yours. and the stream is now making a border even though there's no enforcement of that border. Because it's believable that if I try to trespass on your land and grab stuff, you'll fight me hard. But you won't fight me hard in order for you to stay on your side of the land and so forth. And you can then imagine a contract where you have an axe that you've chipped out of a flint axe, a lot of work. I've got a bunch of apple trees. There are some other trees that are shading my apple trees. So I say, look, let's make a deal. You cut down those trees with your axe, and I'll give you a bushel of apples every year. And so you make that deal. Why do I keep giving you a bushel of apples? Well, I wouldn't have. Well, you might say because you can threaten to cut down my apple trees with your axe, but you could have threatened that before you cut down the tree that was shading them. And the answer is that the fact that we have made the agreement means that I can believably commit myself to enforcing the terms of the agreement, where I couldn't believably commit myself to various other things. And I've applied that set of ideas in a bunch of ways. I've just been working on a Substack post based on an old article of mine in which I'm trying to explain why people believe in just prices. Because economists don't believe in just prices. All right. And one of the puzzles that I'm trying to answer is why price control is politically popular when prices are going up and not when they're stable. That if you think about it as an economist, price control tends to impose net costs. It prevents an efficient allocation of goods. But at the same time, it transfers, at least for a little while, from sellers to buyers because you hold prices down. And in the case of rent control, that can be for quite a while because rent is long-term contracts. So why is it that if prices are going up at 10% a year, there is pressure for rent control? And if prices are stable, there is not pressure for a law saying all rents have to go down by 10%. And ultimately, the answer comes down, I think, to people believing in just prices. And I then have a story, which I'm not sure is right, but it's an interesting story, in which we have evolved a tendency to believe in just prices. Because in the environment that we spent most of our species history as, which is basically hunter-gatherer groups, all markets were thin. And in a thin market, if there is a price you've been selling your services to me at, and something changes so that I'm willing to pay a higher price, the value of the good goes up to me, I would like to keep paying the old price. The belief in just prices, the belief that you're obligated to sell to me in the future at the price you sold me in the past, is a commitment strategy. And if I've got that hardwired in, then I can make sure that when the good is especially valuable to me, the extra consumer surplus goes to me rather than as producer surplus to you. And I work it through in more detail. I'll probably put that Substack post up sometime in the next week or so, because it and another one I want to have up before I put a third Substack post, which is about how you decide how to make sense of the world. Where I'm going to argue that one way, if you're an economist, is to say, why does economics really explain what seems to be very puzzling behavior? Another way is to say, well, economics doesn't really explain it, but it's consistent with it because you can assume some particular function that explains this behavior. And the third way is to say, forget about economics. Is there some other structure that makes sense of it? And that's evolutionary biology or evolutionary psychology is the one that I'm using here for the just price belief. And I claim in my article that I have evolutionary psychology explanations for the endowment effect, the fact that people value something that they own more than the identical thing they don't own, and for the failure of people to discount the future in the way economists think they should. So that's a case where I'm saying, all right, economics is really neat. Here's another system of thought, rather like economics, actually. It's just economics for genes instead of for people, as it were. And maybe some of the things that economics doesn't explain can be explained that way. which is again sort of fun. But mostly, I think that I feel as though the way I pay for the space I occupy in reality is by coming up with interesting new ideas, and that's more entertaining than uh, going over slight improvements of existing old ideas.
Yeah, it's very interesting there. You talking about commitment strategies and whether that be applied to evolutionary biology, prices, legal systems, and that in a way am I right in saying that we are collectively enforcing, say, laws and prices, and so we do have, for example, laws preventing people from stealing. But I mean, would you argue that in a way our collective sort of commitments and responses say to go after someone who steals something, even if it's not necessarily that valuable to us? Is that actually perhaps one of the dominant mechanisms for why we generally have peace?
Yep. I
Mm,
I think at least my conjecture is that that set of mechanisms is why civil societies function. I have my first book is called The Machinery of Freedom, and each section starts with a poem. And one of the new sections, when I did the third edition, is a poem which is attacking Hobbes' view. Uh, this famous thing about how in the state of nature, life of man is, et cetera, and short is miserable. And I point out that Hobbes is saying this will happen unless you have an all-powerful king. Uh,
mm,
Humans, however, have lived for a long time without all powerful kings, and we're still alive. So there's got to be something wrong. And I'm therefore suggesting that what's wrong ultimately is that he's missing the structure of sort of interlocking commitment strategies by which people maintain order, even without uh, even without the
mm.
uh, without government. And, that's related, I suppose, to my view that the ideal society wouldn't have a government. Although whether it's right, I don't know. But I think it's at least plausible that one could have a functional society with no government. Uh, since I'm sitting here
Mm.
with access to my computer, I'm just seeing if I can find that. Here we are.
Sure, go for it.
Here is my response to Hobbes. Hobbes had a vision, certain, crystal clear. Through logic's lens alone, he clearly saw the state of nature, red in tooth and claw and sword and axe, where each man lives in fear. A nightmare world, unless a king appear, equipped with force enough to overawe all powers else and bend them to his law. A monarch absolute, without a peer. One question yet remains. In many lands, men lived and fathered children, planted grain, slept soundly through the night, worked with their hands, together or apart, for love or gain. How is it that the human race survived through the long years before the king arrived? And that's basically
Mm,
my response to Hobbes. Uh, but I try to think about lots of different things. So
yeah.
part of the fun of doing the Substack and before that of doing my blog is that it's a place where I can write short things about whatever has recently occurred to me. Uh,
Yeah. And thank you for sharing your ideas and something that we've touched on here, but not dived into is anarchy and anarchism. I suppose you would describe yourself as an anarchist. So would you be able
yes,
to explain what anarchy is and
sure.
why we should think about it?
Anarchy is Anarchy is the belief that societies can function without a government. And that actually goes back to what I was saying before, because then the puzzle is how do you define a government? And the set of institutions which I sketched in my first book and expanded on in the later editions of that, there are mechanisms for enforcing law. So it's not anarchy in the sense of chaos, uh, but it is. Then the question is, how does a government differ from other institutions? Uh, and just a minute.
Sure.
just want to find something else that
Hmm.
yeah, here we are. The and I think the define going back to my idea that in a civil order people have certain things they're committed to. A government is the organization against which people drop those commitment strategies. So if the if somebody grabs my kid's toy and goes running down the street, I go after him. If the government tells me that they've raised my taxes and I'm going to have to give them another $1,000 this year, I don't go after them. I don't react violently at all. If somebody tells me you are going to work for me, you don't have any choice, I would refuse and fight him. If I get a notice for jury duty, I don't react that way. And yet that's basically a form of very temporary, very minor slavery because it's a job I've been given that I didn't choose. And so I think that's the defining characteristic of government. And to me, at least, thinking about it that way, anarchy is a system which does not depend on any such institutions. And the particular version that I've sketched out as a conjectural form is one in which individuals are customers of private firms that sell them the service of protecting their rights and enforcing and settling their disputes. Every pair of such firms whose customers might interact with each other agree in advance on a private court that will settle their disputes. And what enforces that agreement is the fact that they're repeat players, that each firm knows that if it refuses to go along with the verdict when its customer loses the case, the other one will refuse to go along when his customer uses the case, and then they end up fighting each other, and fighting is much more expensive than not fighting. Going back to the definition of anarchy, I've got another the poem for a different section of the same book. Government produces all order. Under anarchy, there is no government. Therefore, anarchy is chaos, QED. In Washington, there isn't any plan with feeding David on page 64. It must be accidental that the milkman leaves a bottle at my door. It must be accidental that the butcher has carcasses arriving at his shop, the very place where when I need some meat, I accidentally stop. My life is chaos turned miraculous. I speak a word and people understand, although it must be gibberish, since words are not produced by governmental plan. Now, law and order, on the other hand, the state provides us for the public good. That's why there's instant justice on demand and safety in every neighborhood. So that
Yeah.
was making the point that that order does not depend on something being done by the government, and therefore anarchy is not, as people often seem to assume,
Mm.
by definition, chaos.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you speak about the ways in which the government can almost replace that systems that humans sort of naturally develop by themselves anyway. If there's no one there to sort of control and tell them what to do. So an interesting thing is that I grew up in Bahrain, which is a small island in the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
and that has a much smaller government than say the UK. And it's funny how much that gets done by people kind of agreeing to things, or and
Yep.
and maybe some things are more inconvenient, and I'm probably missing useful things that the UK government does, which they do some, but like you kind of get by, and
Yes.
and in some ways it's better because you kind of feel it. Like, even I think of a tiny, maybe a silly example of people crossing the street, and I see people in the UK waiting for the green light when they walk across the street, even though there's clearly no cars, and it's like
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to let someone tell you to cross the street.
Yes.
You can go if there's no cars.
Yeah.
But yeah.
When we spent a year in England when I was about 10 or so, and one of my father's comment was that the English national letter was Q, because English people queue up for things
Mm.
uh, a good deal more than other people. That,
Yeah.
uh,
And
but also, I mean, the government. I don't know the exact figures for England, but it probably consumes about 40% of your income,
mhm.
uh, and I don't think that it produces an equivalent amount of value. But but no, I mean, there are certainly problems. There are some things which is very hard to do without a government. In both the first and the third edition of my book, each has a chapter on the problem of national defense, which is, I think, that is the standard economic argument analysis of market failure is correct. There are situations in which individuals making their own decision won't get the right result. What's wrong with it is that people forget that market failure is not limited to markets in the ordinary sense, that exactly the same logic applies to political institutions. And if you think about, basically, market failure happens because individuals take actions where they're not bearing the net cost of the action. They're either not getting the benefit of their action or they're not paying the cost of the action. And if there's an action you take and you don't get the benefit, you may not take it even though the benefit is larger than the cost and it's worth taking. And if there's an action you take and you don't bear the cost, you may take it even though you shouldn't, because the net cost to you and other people is larger than the benefit. And that's the basic logic of externalities and public goods and the standard list of market failures. And the problem is that those really are reasons why a perfect laissez-faire society won't be perfect, why there will be things worth producing that don't get produced and things produced that shouldn't be produced. The problem is that we don't have an alternative, that the political mechanism also suffers that. And in fact, in the political mechanism, market failure is the norm, not the exception. That if you think about an ordinary free market, you start taking economics. To first approximation, on a free market, everybody bears his costs and receives his benefits. That the price of everything the price of all your inputs is equal to their marginal cost of production and equal to their marginal value to alternative users. So in the simple sort of perfect competition, full information model of a market, you get a perfectly efficient outcome. Now that's only an approximation because there are lots of cases where that isn't true. But there is no such approximation for the political system. If you think about, say, a democratic political system, in order for it to work, the individual voters have to be well informed so that they can vote out the bad guys and vote in the good guys. But an individual voter who spends time and effort figuring out who he should vote for is producing a pure public good that the benefit will be shared by everybody else in his society. But the cost of finding that out is going to be substantial and goes to him. So the result is that voters are rationally ignorant. I remember doing the experiment a good many years ago when I was teaching an undergraduate class in California, of asking the students how many of them knew who their congressman was. And the U.S., you voted 18, so essentially all college students are voters. About half of them knew the name of their congressman. It's really hard to observe somebody and figure out whether you ought to vote for him if you don't know his name.
Right.
But that's not irrational behavior because the information wasn't useful to them. And it's true in lots of other contexts. If you think about, my standard example is a tariff. A tariff produces a benefit to the protected industry. An auto tariff means that American auto companies will be able to sell more cars at a higher price because there'll be less European and Japanese competition. It imposes the cost most obviously on all consumers, all Americans who buy cars, and less obviously on all producers of export goods, because if we import less, we'll export less. That's something that hopefully you've learned in economics, so it's not obvious to non-economists. However, the industry is a small number of firms. I don't know what the current number is, but let's say 4 or 5 U.S. auto firms, plus one union, the United Auto Workers. They can reasonably enough say to themselves, look, the total benefit to us of getting this tariff is $20 billion. The benefit to my firm is $2 billion. I'll chip in $100 million in order to bribe the politicians to pass the tariff. With a small number of players, you can negotiate to produce a public good. The victims are roughly 300 million people, each of them bearing a very small cost as a result of the tariff. It's not even worth their knowing that it's happening, let alone they're paying an appropriate bribe. So even though as an economist would tell you, the auto tariff almost certainly imposes costs on Americans larger than the benefits to Americans. It imposes benefits to the politician who passed it larger than the cost to the politician who passed it. So that's one example of the general point that it isn't that laissez-faire is perfect. It's only that the alternative is usually less perfect, is usually more imperfect. There was a FAQ written by somebody who I like about why my kinds of views are wrong, where he had a line, something to the effect about that market failure prevents efficient results unless you set up a government to solve it. And I told him that he could omit the last few words, that the
And it,
problem exists whether or not you have a government.
yeah, no, it's
So,
interesting. You talk there about like with politicians and politics, you know, rationally uninformed, like you may as well not care about it because someone else is going to be making a decision and you probably can't influence the vote. And I suppose with say markets, where every dollar counts, actually you're there sort of maximally incentivized to do something and do the right
because
thing for
the
you.
result of your buying a Honda instead of a Ford is ultimately that about one more Honda gets produced.
Mm,
Uh, and furthermore, the result of your getting a Honda instead of a Ford is that you get a Honda instead of a Ford. So if the Honda is actually a better car for you, you get the benefit. Whereas the result of your voting for Biden instead of Trump or Trump instead of Biden is not that you get him. It's that the chance that that person is elected goes up by 1 part in 10 million or something, which is not really worth worrying. So therefore, what really happens is you decide who to vote in terms of how you feel good about voting for, who you like, who your friends approve of, and so forth.
mm.
There's some interesting stuff by a law professor now, I think at Yale, uh, who was looking at the relation. The question is really why people believe things. And he's looking at controversial issues like abortion or global warming or things of that sort. And his conclusion is that the more sophisticated you are, the more scientifically well informed you are, the more likely you are to agree with the people who matter to you, whether that means believing in evolution or not believing in evolution. And the argument is that if you're in a town of religious fundamentalists and they know that people who believe in evolution are wicked people, it is very much in your interest to not believe in evolution. And uh, and if you're smart, you can figure out plausible arguments for why you don't have to believe in evolution.
Mm.
Uh, and uh, I have tried unsuccessfully to get him to apply his ideas to himself. This is somebody who was a colleague of mine a long time ago, uh, because there are things that he believes which I think are not true, but which are the things that not believing would make him very unpopular with his fellow Yale professors. Uh, so I mean, his point is that it's rational behavior. It's irrational in a sense because you're believing things that aren't true, but it's rational for you to believe in them because it makes you better off to believe in them than not to believe in them.
Mm.
Whereas believing that Fords are better cars than Hondas makes you worse off if it isn't true.
Yeah, it's I this specific issue of we of almost self censorship and literally changing our beliefs based on the fact that it benefits us. I was thinking about it because recently it's so tangible. Like I think about myself, there's some ideas which are controversial, and I'm like, well, actually that might be true, but there's always going to be some uncertainty with any idea that I have. So I'm like, well, the uncertainty bound. I'll
Yep.
just, I might actually be wrong. So I sort of have an excuse for myself.
Yep.
I'll leave that one.
Yeah. I
And
think you can see it pretty clearly with religion. That is to say that most people either are in an environment where everybody knows that good people are Christians, and whether or not they really believe in it, they sort of believe in it. And other people are in an environment where everybody knows that anybody who really believes in religion is sort of a primitive, uneducated person, and sophisticated people are all atheists. And then you have a strong inclination to be an atheist, and it doesn't much depend on the arguments, although you can have fun trying to think up arguments on either side of that.
Mm.
Uh, so, yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
are there? Yeah, thanks for that. And I mean, are there any issues that we might collectively, as a society, think are controversial and won't voice our opinions on that you hold? I
Sure.
guess.
The one in the last couple of decades would have to do with climate change. That is to say, as best I can tell, it is indeed true that average global temperatures are gradually trending up. And it is quite likely that the reason is human action, although climate's a very complicated system, so it's hard to be certain. But it is not at all clear that this change is a bad thing. So that if you really try to look at it, climate change has both good and bad effects. They are spread over a long and very uncertain future. One cannot reasonably judge how large either the positive or negative effects are, and so it's not at all clear whether the sum is positive or negative. And I've spent a good deal of time, I have a bunch of Substack posts and other things, looking at specific issues, and I've concluded that the current orthodoxy is being defended by making arguments that are obviously wrong. One of my examples, which was I had a Substack post on, is an article estimating the cost of carbon dioxide. And the article was published in Nature, which is a very reputable magazine. It is being considered by the Environmental Protection Agency as a basis for regulation. And the article does its calculations with the implicit assumption that there will be no progress in medicine for the next 300 years. That about half of the cost they have is increased mortality due to temperature, due to the world getting warmer. It's not at all clear, in fact, that the world getting warmer increases mortality. That's a much more complicated question. But putting that aside, it is clear that the better your medical technology is, the less likely you are to die from anything, including heat or cold. Hence, if what they are doing is taking figures on mortality from heat and cold from the recent past and assuming that those same figures will apply for the next 3 centuries, because they're running their data out, they're calculating at 2300. They are also assuming implicitly that how vulnerable you are to heat and cold does not depend on how rich you are. And that's obviously wrong, that poor people have to go out in bad weather and rich people don't. And, rich people have air conditioning and poor people don't. The model they're using has per capita GNP tripling by the end of the century, going up about 11-fold by the end of their period. And they have no allowance at all for that reducing mortality from heat and cold. So those are examples where they're doing work that's obviously nonsense, and yet it's being taken seriously because it's the respectable position, as it were. So there are lots of other examples. I've been doing this for like 20 years or so, and I in fact started earlier because I was interested in the question of population growth about 50 years ago or close to 50 years ago, and I wrote a piece on that a very long time ago, in which I had basically the same argument that increasing population, everybody at the time thought it was obviously a bad thing, and there were predictions about the terrible things that would happen if we didn't do something drastic to reduce the number of children being born. And I attempted at the time to estimate the net externality. When you have one more child, what costs and benefits occur outside the family? And I concluded that I couldn't tell whether that was positive or negative. It was too uncertain. Everybody else almost everybody else thought it was negative. And in fact, the predictions didn't come true. That the basic prediction was that at least in poor countries, if they don't keep their population down, they're going to be starving. Well, the poor countries did not keep their population down. They're still poor, but they're considerably less poor than they were in 1965 or 1970 when these predictions were made. And the calorie consumption per capita has gone up, not down. So that was a case where there was an orthodoxy, almost respectable as it were, believed in it, and
Hmm.
it was nonsense. So I think anyway, uh, but 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 having had that experience made me much more willing to question the orthodoxy on climate
Hmm.
when it came out. Uh,
Yeah, I would love to speak a little bit about your thinking about population growth, especially because you were an economist so long ago as well, and then you're here now as well, and because with population declines actually being a kind of issue that some experts think
mm,
about, even though perhaps in a lot of general media it's not necessarily an issue. It's again given that the narrative before was that there's too much population growth.
yes.
Is it strange now that it kind of seems that falling populations, especially in the Western world, will be such a big issue? Like, how has the shift been, and how did we kind of miss it?
Yeah. Well, but there are really two different issues here. One of them is predicting what would happen to population, and the other is an opinion of what the consequences would be. And uh, I think predicting what would happen, the mistake was just being too confident about a very uncertain future. One of my books is called Future Imperfect, and it's trying to look, it was written, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, I suppose. Uh, and it's trying to look at technologies that might radically change the world. Uh, and when I wrote that, I concluded that I really couldn't do what I was doing for more than about 30 years into the future. That the future is just too uncertain uh, to know. So I could say if this technology develops, this might happen. If that one does, but I don't know which ones are going to develop. And uh, uh, even if I did, as it were, changes compound on each other, as it were, uh, over time. And so I think the general idea of being confident of what was going to happen to population was a mistake. But I don't know whether there was a good way in which somebody in 1965 could have correctly predicted that by 2020, populations would be beginning, birth rates would be below replacement, which is what basically happened for
Hmm.
most of the developed world. Uh, and people didn't really think. I guess some people thought that would be it would be a good thing if it happened. I think there were people who thought the world would be much better if the population went down a good deal. And in a sense, a lot of that comes from imagining that there's a fixed pool of stuff getting divided among people. And there are a few things for which that's true. There's a fixed amount of land on the earth and a given amount of oil and so forth. On the other hand, as I think Julian Simon, who was the main critic of these views, put it at the time, every baby who is born has not only a mouth to eat, but hands to produce stuff with. Uh, and Simon wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource, and his point was the ultimate resource is people. Uh, and I remember at the time I did a calculation. This was again probably in the late 60s or so, of looking at countries' population density. And the question is, were the densely populated countries poor countries? Because that was really an implicit assumption. And part of that was because people were confusing the size of the population with the density. That India and China were poor countries with very large populations, but they're huge countries. They are not, in fact, very densely populated. And at the time, I did the arithmetic. And at the time, the 5 most densely populated countries consisted of 3 rich European countries, Belgium, the Netherlands, and I don't remember what the third one was, and 2, uh, no, I'm wrong. It was two rich European and 3 countries that were in the process of becoming rich, namely Taiwan, South Korea, and Singapore. And Hong Kong had a population density, I think, 10 times that of Singapore, which was the most densely populated country. But it wasn't a country; it was a crown colony. But in fact, the countries that were really poor were not densely populated. They weren't anyway.
Interesting.
So that was sort of a
Sorry.
a very naive way of looking at the world, where people said, well, there's a certain amount of stuff in there, and if you divide it up among more people, there'll be less per person, and that clearly is wrong, because although there are some fixed resources, the main thing that makes people rich is people being productive. And Hong Kong, as you probably know, starting out with much denser population and very, very poor population initially. At this point, I think it's the case that at this point the per capita income is above that of Britain.
Mm.
Uh, the
It's gone.
No, I was just going to say that was a case. Hong Kong is a weird case because they had just had the good luck to be ruled by a British civil servant who was out of date,
Right,
uh,
right.
and who therefore more or less believed in laissez-faire, which at that time the British government didn't believe in, and the result was that the UK got the up-to-date ideas, and
Mm.
Hong Kong got the out-of-date ideas, and Hong Kong did much better than the UK as a result.
No, it's very interesting you talking about how places with higher populations they do actually, strangely sometimes do better, right? If you look at the past places that initially had higher populations, they had proportionally high growth. It seemed that you could say Roma's ideas about ideas and technology being the driver of growth sort of was true, and that
Hmm.
comes from people and having people to make those
Yeah.
ideas and those technologies. I mean, it's also interesting you talk about how uh, perhaps we couldn't have predicted that this would happen, that actually now population birth rates are below replacement level. But talking to Robin Hanson, he talks about how actually, if you look at ancient Rome, and these other civilizations, they actually did come across these kinds of problems, and you have a richer population maybe, and they it's actually like a struggle, and they knew it was a struggle and a problem, and yet they couldn't solve it. So I'm kind of wondering maybe if you have any thoughts on why people don't want to have kids, even though we're
Huh.
getting richer, and you think in a way you
Yep.
think we could support more. This is kind of a dichotomy I had recently on my podcast. Those places in the world which could and would be beneficial to have more kids are the ones that think, oh, we can't have them, and it's the
Yeah.
developed
But
world that has more.
that is part. There are really sort of two sides to that. One is the evolutionary biology, and one is the economics. And on the evolutionary biology, what went wrong was that the genes didn't program their robots well enough. We're the robots. That there's a nice book called The Selfish Gene, which you may have read, which is an explanation of evolutionary biology. And he points out that there are science fiction stories in which people make robots and the robots revolt against them. And he argues it's really happened. We're the robots. That is to say that evolutionary biology says that what our genes are metaphorically trying to do is to produce individuals who will have as many children as possible. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's
Mm-hmm.
roughly what it is. They do that by making people like sex, by making people like cuddling babies and small children, and a bunch of other indirect tweaks to our design, as it were, that is. And it, the problem is that one of the other things they did was to make us smart, because for a while being intelligent resulted in your having more kids, getting more resources. And we got smart enough to realize that that our interests were not the same as our genes' interests, and so we invented birth control and pets as a substitute for children, uh, and various other things, which meant that an individual maximizing his utility might choose not to have nearly as many children as he could have. From the economic standpoint, uh, a good deal of it really is the question of externalities. When you have an extra child, who bears how much of the cost and who bears gets how much of the benefit? Uh, it's not clear on net. The Some of the benefit, a good deal of the benefit, goes to other people because your child will pay taxes. Uh, the benefit of your child inventing new things will mostly go to other people because we don't have very good mechanisms for transferring those benefits back to the person who produces them. And the costs are mostly paid by you, especially large costs in time and effort for rearing children. Now, as you may know, Brian Kaplan has got a book where he's arguing essentially that part of the problem is that people greatly overestimate what they have to do to bring up their children. And that if you believe that it requires essentially that rearing a child is a full-time job for at least one adult, that makes it very costly. And Brian's argument is that it really isn't, that if you look at the evidence, you have to make sure your kid is fed and has clothes and things, but mostly kids can entertain themselves and each other, and can educate themselves by, reading stuff and interacting with other people. I like to say that I only discovered that geology was an interesting subject when I fell in love with a geologist. And I think it works for kids too, in a sense. That is to say that one good way of getting educated is to be friends with somebody who's really interested in something, and will. My adult son will talk your ear off on the subjects of history because history is what he likes, and he will explain why Joan of Arc is the best evidence he knows of for religion because her history is unusually well documented for something that early, and how Japanese politics was dominated by assassination in the, I guess, late 19th, early 20th century, and all sorts of other things that he finds interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk there about like we think that children take so much resources to care for, and I mean I can't speak for it. Maybe my parents be complaining about me now if they watch this, but like it's kind of in that book that you mentioned by Brian Kaplan, it's actually hard to influence kids and how they grow up. Like we think as parents that you have so much influence on your kid and you need to be there for them and do these things, but then actually like with twin studies and adoption studies, like it's just really hard to actually change them. And like as you say, if you let them do what they want, read what they want, they kind of turn and adapt into what they were going to be anyway. So sometimes it's kind of futile that we
that's related. I'm trying to remember the nurture assumption is the book. There's another case where there was an orthodoxy, not in my field. There were a whole bunch of views about what made children turn out the way they did. And a woman who had gotten an undergraduate degree, maybe a master's degree in psychology at Harvard, and had been told by her professor that she didn't have a future as an academic. And she got married and had children and helped support the family by co-authoring child development textbooks. And she eventually concluded that what was in the textbook was largely not true, and wrote an article for, I think, a major psychology journal. And the article was arguing essentially that ordinary child rearing doesn't have very much effect on how children come out, and she had quite a lot of evidence. She also argued, was that article or not, that birth order is not very important, that it's an interesting case that what was going on with the birth order literature is if you do statistics with a reasonably small sample, you will almost always get something that looks significant. And so one person does some research on birth order and how kids turn out, and they says, yes, the older child will be more aggressive. And then another person does the birth order and says, well, actually, the pattern is that the younger child will have some other characteristic, and the middle child. And so they all agree that birth order matters, but then when you combine their stuff, it turns out they're all claiming they matters in different ways. And anyway, she published the article. It got a lot of attention, especially because nobody knew who she was. She wasn't a professor at a school. And the article got the Journal's award for Best Article of the Year, which award was named after the professor who told her she had no future as an academic, from which I think her comment was that God has a sense of humor. But it's a neat book, and it is making the arguments that you're describing. I suspect that Brian Kaplan probably cites it. I don't remember, in his book. And her basic view is that human beings, are very good at realizing that there are different rules in different social environments, and that therefore the child in the family will behave in the ways that fit that social environment. In his peer group, he will behave in the ways that fit into that environment.
Mm.
And generally, the adult personality is the peer group personality, because you don't end up staying in your family, but you end up interacting with other people. So by her argument, the best way of influencing how your kid grows up is by getting him in a school or in some other context or in a church or something where he's interacting with the kind of people you want him to interact with, who will make him,
Mm.
hardworking and happy and whatever things you're trying to get your kid to be. But it's an interesting book, and uh, the and in general, I have to say I enjoy cases where there is an orthodoxy and somebody smashes it
Mm.
convincingly. And of course, it's not always true. Sometimes the orthodoxy is right, and the people who smash it are just clever people. But I think this one has stood up pretty well, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, and so there with the birth order, like I've heard that the first child will be more intelligent, and so the things like that hold up, or is it just as you say? It's,
According to Judith Harris, who's the person I'm
mm,
describing, they don't. That
right.
that is, and some of it is literally fraudulent. That
Mm,
there's somebody who got a lot of attention for stuff which was looking at English history and was claiming various correlations with birth order. And according to her, if you actually pushed him to get it to show his data, he wasn't willing to do it because it wasn't true. Uh, and that's an extreme case, and you do get some stuff in academia which really is fraudulent. But I think much more what's happening is that if you come up with a result that contradicts what the people around you want to believe, you've got a strong incentive to try to tweak your work and try to redo the study and change some things until you get a result that's acceptable. And if you don't get a result that's acceptable, maybe you don't publish that piece and do some other research. So there are a lot of mechanisms, uh, ranging between perfectly honest people who simply find that they can publish things that agree with whatever the current orthodoxy is more easily than things that disagree, up to people who are doing deliberately fraudulent work. And I
mm,
think both of them happen. There's, as you may know, there was what was referred to as the replication crisis in psychology mainly, uh, and there it looked as though there were a bunch of very popular, widely believed, striking results that weren't true. And most of them were probably not due to fraud. Most of them were probably due to the fact that people didn't that the people doing them didn't understand statistics very well, and therefore you could do something, get what looked like a significant result, and publish it. Uh, and unless somebody else did it again 2 or 3 times and found out that it wasn't that they didn't get the result, nobody ever knew that your initial result was bogus.
right.
Uh,
It's interesting there that I've been talking to some meta scientists, people who are in academia studying ways in which we can improve science, and like on
mhm.
that point on poor statistical understanding, sometimes studies which are literally the ones that are improbable and literally not true, because of that fact, someone that does get a false positive finding and they go, wait, this is true, they're the ones that get loads of attention. Whoa, this person found this amazing result we didn't
Yes,
expect. And yeah, we genuinely shouldn't have expected that. And it's and
yes. The way I sometimes put it is that one of the things that gets you published is a new result, and false results are more likely to be new than true results.
mm,
Right? If a proposition is true, it's quite likely someone else has discovered it. If it's false, it's quite likely that nobody else has discovered it. So if you can discover it because you get results which seem to confirm that, then you can get a lot of attention. Uh,
mm.
yeah, no, that's certainly one problem at the moment. Uh,
I
and
yeah.
people talk about peer review as if it solved the problem, but it doesn't really solve it, because the reviewer is not in a position to redo the whole experiment, uh, and because if the article agrees with the views of the editor who assigns peer reviewers, he is likely to assign peer reviewers who are already sympathetic and therefore likely to believe in it. And of course, one of the ways you can do it as an author is to cite people who you think will be sympathetic, because the editor, if he doesn't know, is likely to look at the people you've cited and say, aha, he cited 3 articles by that guy. He must be an expert in this field. Let's have him referee the article.
Yeah, interesting. Go on.
The
Okay, if you wanted to say something, go for it.
No,
But
I was just remembering something odd that happened in my case, but it's not really very relevant.
okay.
Namely, I had an article and I submitted it to a third-rate journal and it was rejected. And I
Hmm.
submitted it to a second-rate journal and it was rejected. And I submitted it to a first-rate journal and it was published.
Okay.
And the reason in that case, it was an article on what was it called? Cold houses in warm cities and vice versa, I think was the title. And the point was, it was really an article about a odd and interesting implication of ordinary economic analysis. And the first 2 journals, I think, sent it to people who were thinking of it as an article about home heating, which it wasn't really about. It was about
Mm.
the logic of rational behavior, implying that houses in cold areas would be kept warmer in winter than houses in warm area, uh, as a result of your equating marginal cost and marginal benefit of heat, and the fact that insulation is a fixed cost. And the colder your environment, the more insulation you're going to have. And the more insulation you have, the lower the marginal cost of temperature, the marginal cost of getting a degree higher. Anyway, it was a fun piece. And
Mm.
it ended up, I think, in the JLE, no, in the JPE, because it got a reviewer who saw what I was doing and thought it was fun.
That's no, that's it's very interesting that sometimes with not just academia but almost anything, it's also about kind of how you sell the idea, and as they say, people have kind of completely misframed the logic of that, and it had like a higher order
Yeah,
just impact. Yeah.
my standard example of that is a interesting article on the. Trying to remember what the title of it is. The title of it is, I think, I gave him the best years of my life, uh, and it's really about uh, issues on long-term contracting, but in the context of marriage. And the
Mm.
point the author makes is that women depreciate faster on the marriage market than men do. That women a woman is less attractive at 30 than at 20. A man has a higher income and is a better catch at 30 than 20. Therefore, if you don't have enforceable contracts, if you have easy divorce, it is tempting for the man when he gets to 40 to say, well, look, I can trade in. I can divorce my 40-year-old wife who really doesn't turn me on very much and get a 25-year-old hottie, and she'll marry me because at 40 I've got a good income.
Mm.
And it was a neat article. And he then argues that one result of this, once divorce becomes easy, is that women engage in less relationship-specific sunk costs. That a woman who is specialized in being the wife to a particular husband is very vulnerable to that tactic. A woman who is mainly a lawyer, but also married and maybe has produced a couple of kids, is less vulnerable, will be less, and that therefore he argues this explains both women being more likely to have professions and also women marrying later.
Mm.
And it's a neat article by Lloyd Cohen, uh, but it was not popular with feminists. And I think the reason it was not popular with feminists was that he put it in terms of women depreciating faster on the marriage market, which they didn't like. He
Mm.
should have put it in terms of a long-term contract where women perform early and men perform late. Because if you think of a contract between 2 firms where it's producing something valuable to both of them, one firm does its part early, other firm naturally at that point wants to back out of the contract. Why should we do our part? We've got your
Mm.
part. And that's, if you think about a sort of traditional marriage, the early years are when the wife is bearing children and putting a lot of time and energy into rearing children. And the husband isn't providing very much income because he's only at the beginning of his career. Whereas if the system works, when the wife is 40, she can sort of retire. The kids are at least at school and maybe off at college by now. She can spend her time playing bridge and enjoying herself. The husband now is getting a good income, and the husband then has a temptation to break that if it's not an enforceable contract. So it was really looking at easy divorce in terms of the economics of long-term contracting, which is a way of solving these problems. But Lloyd chose to put it in a way that antagonized people instead of in a way that would have gotten the same people sympathetic with him, which they should have been, given that it was about a way in which women got cheated, in effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's also interesting because that's also in a way another mechanism for seeing how the ease in which divorces can happen can impact, say, falling birth rates. So in a way, it
That's
doesn't
right.
just impact
That's
women there,
right.
but also families there.
That's
Yeah.
right. That a child is a relationship specific sunk cost, right?
Mm.
It's a whole lot less convenient if the parents are no longer married to each other. And therefore, one way of hedging against that is to have two children instead of three, or one instead of two. Yeah, but that's also an example, going back to what we were saying about economics. The kind of economics that I find fun is what Lloyd Cohen was doing there. That is, using economics to make sense of real world phenomena, but ones that weren't usually thought of as economic. That
Mm.
obviously a marriage is a long term contract, but people don't aren't used to thinking of it in that language. Uh, so so yeah, I mean that would be
Mm-mm.
all of those are the sort of stuff I try to do, and the sort of stuff that I like other people doing.
In terms of your interests in economics and how your work is developed, would you be able to say anything about how your parents, Milton Friedman and Rose Friedman, impacted your, say, choice and interest in economics and how your thought has developed?
Sure. Uh, I think thinking of economics in that sense is something that I got largely from my father, that I think, and in a way it goes back to this math versus other things thing, that my impression from what I obviously I wasn't around when he was starting his career, but my impression is that part of what happened was that Chicago became a place where people thought of economics as really being about the real world rather than about theorems. Uh, and that
Hmm.
in that sense, that division goes way back. Now, most of the stuff my father was doing, well, was closer to conventional subjects than mine, but things like arguing against the draft on economic grounds, on the grounds that you uh, that it made more sense to have a market where the people who were had the best combination of low other alternatives and good abilities for the army were in the army, instead of people who happened to get grabbed by the draft. uh, and floating exchange rates. Again, there are a number of things where he pushed ideas. Uh, Now, quantity theory of money goes back at least to Hume, I think, maybe farther
Hmm.
than that. Uh, and that was just a case where he was disagreeing with an orthodoxy, and so I think that part of my willingness to reject orthodoxies comes from the fact that I grew up at the point when he was successfully demolishing an orthodoxy, namely 1960s Keynesianism. When I went to Harvard, and I remember when I was probably a sophomore or something, a conversation with another student who didn't know who I was. No reason he should have, where he had, I think, taken one economics course, and he said he couldn't study economics at Chicago. He'd burst out laughing. And it struck me as a nice example of just how biased what he was being taught was, that it might be that the Chicago view of economics was right, but it was not believable that somebody who had that a sophomore or whatever who had a course in economics could know enough to know that it was right. So that meant that it was being presented in a one-sided kind of way. This is one of my views on sort of political things, is that you shouldn't really reject a political view unless you can make arguments for it about as well as the people who believe in it, because you ought to understand and this goes back to something else that happened when I was at Harvard. In 1964, the Republicans nominated Barry Goldwater, who was a Arizona senator who was much more free market than either most of the Republicans or most of the Democrats were. And my father was sort of an unofficial advisor to him. And I I was in favor of him, of course. And at some point, I got into a conversation with a stranger, I think in a lunch counter kind of place, about the election. I was probably wearing a Goldwater button. That's my guess of how it started, but I'm not sure. But basically, what he was saying was, how can you defend such and such a position of Barry Goldwater's? How can you defend? And each case, it was clear when I offered the argument for the position that he had never heard it. That, he was sure it was wrong, but he didn't actually have a readily available rebuttal to whatever argument I was offering. And at the end of the conversation, he asked me in a sort of a very much trying not to offend kind of tone whether I was taking all of these positions as a joke. And I interpreted that as the political version of what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this. How could I be smart enough to make arguments for Goldwater's position that he couldn't easily reject when he knew the position was wrong, and stupid enough to actually believe in them? And I've sort of thought of that as a nice symbol of the general problems which exist when you have an orthodoxy and a lot of people who are sure it's true and don't really understand the arguments for and against it. And I think that's true in climate. It was true in population. It was true in the psychology stuff and the child rearing stuff and all the rest of it. And I enjoy spotting it. Now, I'm sure I'm sometimes wrong. There may be orthodoxies which are right. But
it's interesting that you talk about how, whether it's on a big scale or like a small scale, I noticed personally, people don't want to change their beliefs, even if you have good arguments. And I am sympathetic for the reason that sometimes people have lived in a certain way, living by and for certain beliefs.
But also you shouldn't change your beliefs just as a result of losing one argument. Because after all, it might just be somebody who's cleverer than you are. So that it seems to me that the right strategy, if you lose an argument on something you care about, is to then find somebody on your side who's smart and make the argument that just convinced you and see whether he can rebut it. No, one of my father's lines was that there's no point in that anybody who can be convinced in one argument can be convinced back in another. But the fact that somebody can make arguments against your position that you can't rebut is a reason you should consider the possibility that you're wrong and should therefore investigate it. And
well, it's interesting there that, so if you, like, let's say you are in an argument and you kind of get proven wrong, so to speak, you're gonna face costs either way though, because either you need to go to someone and say, am I actually wrong? And if you are actually wrong, that's like big psychological life costs. Wait, what am I gonna have to sort of restructure and rethink? And
well, I can think of only one case where I lost an argument and it seriously changed my thinking. I have a chapter on it in the third edition of my first book. And that was an argument with Isaiah Berlin, who was a fairly prominent philosopher who happened to be visiting at Harvard when I was an undergraduate. And if people are curious, the Machinery of Freedom is up on my webpage. You can read it for free as a PDF. And the chapter is, I think, called An Argument I Lost. But it really had to do with moral philosophy and with my eventual, and I don't know whether my eventual conclusion is the same thing as his was or not. All I know is that he showed me that there were things seriously wrong with what I then believed, and I then reconstructed, as it were, allowing for that, and ended up in a very different position. I ended up as what's referred to as a moral realist, as somebody who believes that it really is wrong to torture children, say, rather than that the belief that when it is wrong to torture children is something I've been indoctrinated with by my society, but nothing is really right or wrong,
mm,
which
mm,
I think is a fairly popular philosophy
mm,
view among many, not certainly not all philosophers, but many philosophers that moral statement is just a mistake, as it were.
mm.
Uh, and that was a case where I concluded that there was a better argument, and I had to find it, and so forth. But
Yeah, and I suppose that the thinking about moralities actually is important if we're thinking about anarchism and libertarianism and what kind of society we want, right? Like that philosophical stance, like it is actually important. I mean, I've heard you mention this on another interview. I mean, is it too long to go into the
what?
philosophy of it, and to be able to
Uh,
express how your views changed?
yeah, I don't think it's worth it. I think
It's probably too
if
difficult.
people are
Okay.
sufficiently curious, Mike Humer is a libertarian philosopher who has written a whole book about intuitionism, which is what I ended up with. But it's basically the view that there actually is a moral reality. It's not the same thing as physical reality. We imperfectly perceive it. We can guess that we're imperfectly perceiving it due to the fact that people mostly have very similar moral intuitions, although not absolutely identical. Uh, I'm not sure it's true. I'm
Mm-hmm.
less sure than Mike Humer is that it's true, but I think there's a good case for it, and it fits what I want to believe, so to speak. I'm
Mm-hmm.
surely
Mm-hmm.
biased as everybody else is in that respect.
Uh, one of the final things I wanted to ask about was just in
Mm,
the present day. I'm wondering what you think of, like you mentioned how sometimes anarchism and free markets they break down because we can't, for example, coordinate properly,
yes.
and we would want to pay to like reduce advertising, but who can how can we all come together and reduce this public
Yeah.
bad? I was wondering what you think of technologies in our present day, like Bitcoin, blockchain, or the internet, and I'm wondering
Yeah.
how these kinds of developments could help instantiate and support free market policies and
Yeah.
how that changes the game.
Yes. Uh, that is Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies have the potential to give you a what I refer to in an old article as a world of strong privacy, a world where two people can engage in economic transactions that it is very difficult for any third person to observe. And since on the whole that strikes me as a good thing, it's not always a good thing. Those things also make it easier to get payoffs for kidnapping, for example. That's one of the downsides of uh, private monies, as it were. Uh, but I think a number of those technologies could make things better. But as I think somebody, one of the early people, probably cypherpunks or that group of people, put it, encryption is not your friend. It's not your enemy either. It's a technology. And public key encryption, which is really the key technology for a bunch of these things, means that you can have a society where people can interact very privately online, where I can send a message to you such that even if the FBI or CIA or somebody reads the message, they can't make any sense out of it. uh, that could be very attractive, but it can also be used for unattractive uh,
Mm.
purposes. So again, my book Future Imperfect probably discusses more of this stuff than anything else. Uh, do tell people my web page, because
Mm.
my web page has got links to most of my published articles and the full text of a number of my books. Uh, and it's daviddfriedman.com.
Mm.
That's easy to remember. It's David D. Friedman because if I'd applied for the URL 6 months earlier, I think I could have gotten davidfriedman.com, but
Oh no.
somebody beat me to it, so I put in my middle initial.
And I'll point them to that and your Substack. And is there anything else that you want to be pointed to, and anything else you want to say as this closes up?
I think those should do it.
Mm-hmm.
If you like listening to me, my webpage also has a link to a page with links to many talks I've given that people have recorded, and interviews and a few debates and so forth, including I think one debate that was like 40 years ago or something, which is sort of fun. Uh, we all looked much younger then. Uh, uh, but I think there's quite a lot of interesting stuff on the webpage, and
Hmm.
that's probably all I can really suggest. But thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye. It was
See
fun.
you.